Clara never imagined that a simple gesture in a restaurant could change everything. She was just a waitress, unseen, moving between expensive tables and rushed glances. But that night, when everyone looked away, she knelt beside a boy in a wheelchair and fed him with a kind of care the world had long forgotten. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching, someone with power, money, and a pain that left him unable to love the way his son needed. The boy was Theo, and the man in the car was Robert Hensley. What started with a fork and a smile became an invitation, then an offer, then a new life. But behind the doors of that luxurious mansion, Clara would discover rooms frozen in time, names no one dared to say, and a grief so deep no one knew how to touch it. This isn't just a story about care. It's a story about falling, about wounds money can't heal, and the courage to face ghosts that never really left, stay until the end. Because when a little boy teaches a man how to fall, the whole world learns how to rise. And before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. You can't help him, Clara. That's not your table. The manager's voice was sharp, almost whispered, like he feared kindness might be contagious. Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the boy, no older than 8, sitting alone at the farthest table by the window. His small hands trembled as he tried to grip the fork, missing his mouth entirely, smearing pasta sauce along his cheek. The room buzzed with casual laughter, knives scraping plates, glasses clinking, and yet no one, not a single guest, not a single staff member, seemed to notice the boy's struggle. Clara took a deep breath, tightened her ponytail, and walked away from the tray of empty dishes, waiting to be cleared. With each step, her defiance grew louder than the ambient noise. She knelt beside him, eye level, her knees on the cold marble floor, ignoring the way the hostess at the bar turned and stared. "Hi," she whispered gently, picking up the fork with calm fingers. "May I help you?" The boy didn't speak, his head tilted slightly, eyes wide, uncertain. She smiled, wiped the sauce from his cheek with a folded napkin, then cut a small piece of lasagna and brought it carefully to his mouth. He opened it, slowly, trust building like a fragile bridge. Theo's jaw trembled slightly as he chewed. Clara waited patiently, her hand resting lightly on the table, her body a quiet shield between him and the oblivious dining room. No one approached. A couple at the next table shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The manager watched from the kitchen door, arms crossed, mouth tight with disapproval. But Clara didn't waver. She kept feeding Theo bite by bite, pausing between each to let him swallow, sometimes dabbing the corner of his mouth with another napkin. There was no pity in her eyes, only presence. Theo, who had learned early not to expect gentleness from strangers, seemed unsure how to respond. His left hand twitched involuntarily, knocking over the small water glass. Clara caught it halfway, steadying it without alarm. "It's okay," she said softly. "Happens to me all the time." Theo blinked. For the first time, his lips curved into the faintest smile. His face relaxed. The muscles around his eyes softened. Clara didn't rush. She had mastered the rhythm of care, something that couldn't be taught in staff training manuals. One bite at a time, she unraveled the wall. Between them, brick by invisible brick, outside through the fogged glass of a black SUV, Robert Hensley watched in stillness. The engine was off, the windows slightly lowered. His driver had gone for coffee. Alone, Robert sat rigid, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze locked on the scene. Unfolding inside the restaurant, he had sent Theo ahead with the nurse, who had apparently vanished. It was a test, perhaps, a quiet one. Not of Theo, but of the world. Would someone help? Would anyone care if there was no money attached, no cameras, no gain? For the last 3 years, Robert had watched doormen look away, teachers avoid eye contact, even doctors speak to him instead of Theo. But now, through the glass, he saw something different. Clara's posture was not professional. It was maternal, but not patronizing. He couldn't hear her voice, but the way she leaned in, smiled and adjusted the fork as if Theo were the only person in the room, it startled him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. He felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar and inconvenient. Inside, Clara Ara didn't glance at the window. She didn't know anyone was watching. Her attention was fully on Theo, who now tried to lift the fork again. His hand trembled, but landed closer to his mouth this time. "Almost," she said encouragingly, letting him try again before guiding his hand with hers. The restaurant was not silent, but it felt like a different world around their small table. The clatter of cutlery and the distant laughter of wealthy patrons blurred into a hum behind the moment. Clara wasn't on the clock anymore, not mentally. She was somewhere else, somewhere slower, quieter, where patience wasn't a luxury, but a necessity. She didn't know his name yet. He hadn't said a word, but she knew the language of isolation. She had served enough ignored customers, watched enough birthdays pass uncelebrated at corner tables, seen enough dates where one person stared at their phone while the other slowly disappeared. She recognized the heavy silence around Theo, the way it clung to his shoulders, so she stayed, feeding him gently, as if time were finally on his side. By the time Robert entered the restaurant, the moment was almost over. Clara was dabbing Theo's hands with a damp napkin, cleaning a smear of sauce from between his fingers. She didn't look up when the door opened. She didn't flinch when the sudden hush fell over the room. Robert walked slowly, his footsteps quiet but unmistakable, his presence drawing attention like a magnet. He stopped just behind Clara, looking down at her with unreadable eyes. She turned slightly, sensing someone close, and found herself staring at a man whose expression revealed nothing. No anger, no gratitude, no recognition, just quiet observation. She blinked, unsure what to say. Theo, still holding the napkin, reached up and touched Clara's shoulder with his small fingers, then looked at Robert. The gesture, so small, seemed to ripple through the air like a stone in still water. Robert's gaze moved from Theo to Clara again, narrowing slightly, calculating without cruelty. He didn't speak. Neither did Clara, but something passed between them, something weightless yet impossible to ignore. After a long pause, Robert finally stepped forward and pulled out a chair. Not for himself, but for Clara. "Sit," he said quietly. It wasn't a command, nor a request. It was an acknowledgement. Clara hesitated only a second before sitting beside Theo. The manager started forward, but stopped mid-step when Robert raised a hand without looking at him. Clara noticed, but said nothing. Her eyes flicked to Theo, who was now visibly more relaxed, his hands resting quietly on the table. "What's your name?" Robert asked, his voice low, steady. "Clara," she replied, suddenly aware. She replied, of the absurdity of the situation, being questioned by a man she instantly recognized from countless magazine covers, business articles, Forbes lists. "And you?" she asked back, half aware it was a silly question. Robert didn't smile, but his eyes held something close to amusement. "I'm just his father?" Clara nodded. "He's a great kid." Robert looked at Theo, who met his eyes without flinching. It felt like the first time in months they were truly seeing each other. The moment lingered, as if the air around them had thickened. Patrons went back to their meals, some sneaking glances, some whispering. The manager retreated. Clara sat still, uncertain whether she had just crossed a line or opened a door. Robert didn't clarify. He simply rose, placed a black card on the table and said, "You'll hear from me." No threat, no praise, just a statement. He turned and walked out, pausing, briefly to look at Theo through the window one last time. Clara remained at the table long after, watching Theo twirl the fork with effort, her hands still resting flat against the cool white linen. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this. Something had shifted, and once shifted. Some things don't return to their original place. You're not on the schedule tonight. Maria, the head hostess, barely looked up from her clipboard as Clara stepped through the employee entrance, tying her apron. The sentence struck her like a misplaced puzzle piece. Confusing, sudden, wrong. She hadn't missed a shift in months. There's a private event, Maria continued, finally meeting Clara's eyes. Entire restaurants closed to the public. Staff was cut to minimum. But her voice faltered, unsure. You were specifically requested to come in. That single sentence made Clara's fingers freeze mid-knot. Her thoughts jumped to the night before. Theo's hesitant smile, Robert's quiet stare, the absurdity of it all. She had gone home expecting a reprimand, maybe even termination. Now she was being summoned? She swallowed hard and walked into the main dining area. The lights were softer. No hum of background conversation, no clatter of dishes. Just one table set for three in the center of the room. Robert sat straight-backed, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his hands folded. Theo was next to him, already looking around, brighter, curious. Clara stopped just beyond the edge of the carpet, unsure whether to approach or apologize. Robert didn't greet her. He simply gestured toward the chair across from them. I'd like you to dine with us, he said, his tone stripped of warmth or hostility. It wasn't a question. Clara's mouth parted slightly, caught between refusal and confusion. This isn't a job offer, he added quickly, almost reading her. It's a test. That word echoed oddly in her ears. She hesitated, eyes darting toward Theo. The boy grinned, an open, toothy grin this time, different from the quiet curiosity of the night before. Clara slowly unknotted her apron and placed it on a nearby chair, stepping forward with care, as if unsure whether the floor would hold beneath her. She sat, her hands folding in her lap. Theo reached across the table, tapping his spoon softly against his plate. Robert didn't look at him. His eyes were on Clara, studying her reactions like she was under a microscope. A waiter brought out a modest meal, 3 plates already served. No menus, no orders. Everything had been decided. Clara noticed small details. Theo's chair now had extra support cushions, his utensils adapted for grip. Someone had prepared for this. As they began eating, Clara made light conversation with Theo. She didn't overthink it, just asked if he liked the carrots, if he wanted help cutting the chicken, if he liked puzzles or games. His answers were fragmented, hesitant, but they were answers. Actual words. Goo. Yeah, like games, he muttered. Eyes lit up. Clara beamed. What kind of games? She asked. Blocks and colors, he added, cheeks flushed with excitement. It wasn't perfect speech, but the rhythm, the effort, each syllable was a small rebellion against the silence that had surrounded him. Robert didn't move. He watched the exchange like someone hearing a new language. Clara reached across, helping Theo with his cup. He didn't spill. He looked proud of himself. She laughed, soft and natural, and he echoed her with a short, high giggle. Robert's fingers flexed on the table once, then stilled. The room no longer felt like a test. It felt like a discovery. Halfway through the meal, Clara asked Theo what his favorite thing in the world was. He paused, looked at her with those large, searching eyes, and then said, "Today." The word came out clear, as if rehearsed in his mind. Robert's fork stopped mid-air. For a second, he seemed to forget himself. Clara glanced at him, expecting perhaps a comment, a reaction, but he simply resumed eating. He's never said that before, he said flatly, not looking up. Not to anyone, not even me. The words carried more weight than their tone suggested. Clara looked at Theo again, who now hummed to himself, tapping his fingers gently along the rim of his plate. She said nothing, but her smile lingered. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, charged. Clara realized that this was what Robert wanted to witness, not just behavior, but transformation. Something money hadn't been able to unlock. Not with therapists, not with doctors, not with technology. She had done it with lasagna, patience, and the absence of pity. Robert finished his meal first, wiping his mouth with precision, folding the napkin beside his plate like an engineer arranging blueprints. He stood, walked to the end of the table, and placed something in front of Clara Ara, a black card embossed in silver, bearing nothing but his name and a number. No logo, no explanation. If you're open to a different kind of conversation, tomorrow, my team will call. His voice remained composed, but she caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a rare crack in a man so composed. Clara Ara picked up the card, but didn't respond. Robert looked at Theo one last time. "Finish your dinner," he said gently, before walking away. The boy nodded obediently, but didn't stop, watching Clara Ara. She smiled, her fingers tracing the edges of the card, the weight of the day still settling into her bones. She had expected a lecture. Instead, she'd been served chicken and a mystery. After Robert exited, the room shifted again. Theo kept eating, now more relaxed. Clara Ara leaned in closer, asking about his favorite color. "Blue," he replied quickly, and whether he liked animals. "Dog, big one," he grinned. The words weren't fluid, but they came with less hesitation now. Each response felt like watching a bud push through frost. Clara Ara kept the tone light, playful. She didn't dare mention Robert or the card or tomorrow. Tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was about Theo finally enjoying a meal that didn't come with stares or silence. She helped him wipe his hands, then folded his napkin neatly. A waiter approached to clear the plates, eyes wide with curiosity, but trained to remain neutral. Clara stood, smoothing her shirt, unsure of what she was now, employee, guest, participant in something undefined. But Theo looked up at her, reached out, and held her hand briefly. No words, just a squeeze. That gesture told her more than anything Robert had said. The walk home felt different. She kept her hands in her pockets, the black card pressing lightly against her thigh. There were no answers in it, just a number and a door not yet opened. She didn't know what tomorrow meant, or if she wanted what waited behind that vague offer. But she knew Theo's laugh. She knew the feel of his small hand wrapped around hers. And somewhere in that surreal evening, Clara Ara understood that whatever came next had already begun. Clara Ara didn't ask questions when the car arrived. She simply stepped inside, silently watching the driver nod without speaking, his hands already adjusting the GPS to a destination she wasn't told. Her mind spun with possibilities. She clutched the black card Robert had given her the night before, now worn at the edges from her fingers' constant fiddling. No one had explained what she was walking into. No promises were made, no job title offered, and yet something in her had already moved forward before her body had caught up. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor of a gleaming, mirrored building downtown, she didn't need to be told she was in Robert Hensley's world now. The space was clinically elegant, marble floors, quiet air, and a single assistant who greeted her with a nod and motioned toward a glass-walled room. Inside, Robert stood alone beside a table holding only 2 chairs, a folder, and a glass of untouched water. "Sit," he said without preamble, and she did, though the chair felt foreign beneath her. "I won't insult you by offering a salary," he continued, flipping open the folder but not looking at it. "I offer something more permanent." Her fingers clenched slightly. "You want to hire me without telling me what for?" she asked, voice steadier than she expected. Robert finally looked at her. "Not hire," he corrected. "Invite." He pushed the folder toward her. Inside, there were documents, housing contracts, healthcare coverage, legal protections, everything except a job description. "What is this?" she asked. "A proposal," he said simply. "I want you to become a permanent presence in Theo's life. Not a caretaker, not a therapist, just someone who sees him." Clara blinked, unable to hide the shock. "You want me to live in your house?" she asked, On the property, the residential wing has a suite, private access. You'd be involved in emotional development planning. You'd have a say in daily routines. You'd be there when I can't. She stared at him, her voice finally cracking. Why me? Robert didn't flinch. Because my son looked at you like he's never looked at anyone, he answered, including me. The air between them thickened, not with sentimentality, but with truth. Clara looked back down at the folder, her breath shallow, thoughts racing. She leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms, her mind rebelling against the sheer absurdity. I don't have a degree in psychology, she said. I've never worked with children officially. I'm a waitress who made a choice in a moment. Robert nodded. Exactly. That's what no one else has done. She paused. What's the catch? He tilted his head. There isn't one. She laughed once, dry and brief. That's rich coming from a billionaire. Robert didn't react. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your life. I'm offering to build space into mine for what my son clearly needs. The offer was stunning, not just for its content, but for the way it challenged her sense of self. She wasn't used to being wanted, not like this, not for who she was when no one was watching. She tapped a finger on the edge of the folder. And what if I say yes and become just another ghost in your big empty house? Robert's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. Then I'll have failed again, but I don't believe that will happen. Clara sat in silence for a long moment, the city stretching far beneath them through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind Robert. I don't want to be invisible, she said finally. Not outside your house, not inside it. Her voice was firm now. If I do this, I'm not going to hide behind doors or be a shadow in the background. Robert nodded once. Agreed. And I won't answer to a schedule typed by someone who's never spoken to your son. Understood. And if I think something's wrong about Theo, about you, about anything, I'll say it. He raised an eyebrow. You'd be expected to. Clara studied his face for a sign of falsehood, but found none. Okay, she said quietly but clearly. Then I'm in. Robert extended a hand. She took it. His grip was firm, brief. The agreement wasn't traditional, and neither of them treated it as such. It wasn't a job. It was a shift in gravity. By the time she arrived at the Hensley estate that evening, the world outside felt like it had peeled away. The mansion loomed ahead, not ominous but sterile, like a museum too expensive to touch. Clara was, escorted not by staff, but by the same assistant from earlier, who led her through a side entrance, up a private staircase, and into a suite unlike anything she'd ever imagined. It was large, elegant, quiet, but not cold. The walls were a soft cream, the furniture minimalist but warm, the windows overlooking a garden that looked curated down to the last petal. You'll have full access, the assistant said. You're expected at breakfast with Mr. Hensley and Theo tomorrow at 8. Clara nodded, still processing. When the assistant left, she stood in the center of the room for a long time, staring at the space that was now hers. No roommates, no rent notices taped to the door, no chipped paint or water leaks. Just silence, and the sense that something was about to begin, not from duty, but from choice. She unpacked slowly, folding her clothes into drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. She placed the single-framed photo of her mother on the nightstand, her fingers brushing the glass. This was not the life she had expected, not when she took that extra shift at the restaurant, not when she knelt beside Theo's chair. She wasn't sure what to call this yet, not a job, not a mission, a place maybe, a role. She took one last look at the bed before sitting on its edge, hands on her knees. Down the hall, she knew, was the child who had changed everything. A boy who smiled at her like he knew something she didn't. A man who offered her a position that money couldn't define. Clara laid back on the bed and closed her eyes, her body still, her mind pacing. Tomorrow she would begin again, not to serve food, but to serve presence. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel replaceable. Clara tapped gently on Theo's door, a light rhythm just loud enough to signal her presence, but not enough to startle him. "Hey, it's me," she said through the wood before easing it open. Inside, Theo sat on the floor, legs folded unevenly beneath him, a crayon clutched in his fist, and a pile of papers spread across the carpet like a chaotic mosaic. He looked up, eyes brightening immediately. "Draw," he said, lifting the crayon in her direction. Clara knelt beside him without hesitation. "Of course," she replied, settling onto the floor and reaching for an orange stick of wax. For the next 40 minutes, they filled page after page. Stick figures with enormous heads, impossible houses, trees with legs. But there was a shift today. Theo added smiles to every face. He pointed at one drawing where a tall figure stood beside a smaller one, both with exaggerated eyes and messy hair. "You," he said, tapping the tall one. "Me," he added, pressing his finger against the smaller. Clara felt her chest tighten. "Is that what we look like?" she asked. Theo nodded. "Happy," he whispered. It wasn't the word that stunned her, it was the certainty behind it. This child, whose words had once come in hesitant fragments, was now defining emotions on paper. Later that afternoon, as Theo napped in the sunroom, a quiet ritual that had gradually replaced the nurse-administered sleep routines, Clara wandered through the house, tracing her steps carefully along the marble corridors. The estate was vast, too vast for a home. Each hallway felt like it led to another world, and several doors remained locked or mysteriously closed at all hours. She hadn't pried until now, but something about the drawing Theo had made tugged at her, as if the truth about this family lingered not in the boy's words, but in what the walls refused to say. Turning a corner near the end of the east wing, she noticed one door slightly ajar. Unlike the others, it hadn't been fully sealed. Curiosity nudged her forward. She pushed it open and stepped into a room untouched by time. The scent of perfume lingered faintly in the air, trapped in curtains that hadn't been drawn in years. A vanity stood beneath a large mirror, its surface still lined with brushes, lipsticks, and a porcelain tray with a single ring. The bed was neatly made, pillows undisturbed. On the wall opposite, a large portrait. Hung, a blonde woman in a flowing dress, her features soft and regal, eyes strikingly similar to Theo's. Clara stood frozen. The mother. She didn't need to ask. The sound of the door swinging open behind her made her spin around. Robert stood in the threshold, face rigid, hands clenched. "You don't belong in here," he said, voice low but trembling with restraint. Clara opened her mouth to apologize, but he stepped fully inside, eyes darting around the room with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between reverence and fury. "This room is not part of your duties," he continued, not looking at her. "It's not part of anyone's duties," Clara swallowed. "I didn't mean to intrude. The door was open." He laughed once, bitterly. "Nothing in this house opens by accident." Silence stretched between them as he walked to the vanity and picked up the ring, rolling it between his fingers like a relic. "She died 3 years ago," he said finally, voice flatter now. "Car crash. She was driving home from an event she didn't want to attend. I insisted she go, said it would help with networking." He looked at Clara then, eyes suddenly red-rimmed but dry. "She left angry. I never got to say I was sorry." Clara didn't move. She understood in that moment that Robert's pain wasn't buried, it was preserved. "She hated this room," Robert said, his gaze scanning the delicate decor. "Said it made her feel like a character in someone else's story. I kept it like this. Anyway," he turned back to the portrait. "Theo was just 5, he doesn't remember her voice, only this face. I thought keeping it would help." Clara stepped closer, not out of boldness, but because she sensed he needed to be met halfway. "It hasn't," she said gently. Robert's mouth twitched, a flicker of reaction. "No," he admitted, "it hasn't." He placed the ring back in the tray and sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped in a posture that made him look older than she'd ever seen him. "She would have hated who I became. She would have screamed at me for turning this house into a mausoleum, but she would have blamed me more if I had moved on. His eyes met Clarara's again. I don't know how to win either way. Clarara exhaled slowly. Maybe it's not about winning. Maybe it's about letting someone else breathe. Robert said nothing, but his eyes, for the first time, shimmered with the weight of something breaking. That night, Clarara helped Theo with his bath, carefully balancing playfulness and routine. He splashed gently, giggling when the rubber duck floated too far from his reach. She fetched it without hesitation. "Duck's name?" he asked. Clarara smiled. "You pick." He paused. "Mama," he said, pointing. Clarara froze. She hadn't expected it. "Why Mama?" she asked softly. "Picture," he answered, mimicking a frame with his fingers. Her throat tightened. "Do you remember her?" He looked down. Eyes. Same. He looked back up at Clarara. "Yours. Not same, but nice." She felt something fracture gently in her chest. "Thank you," she said, running a towel through his hair. He leaned into her touch, unafraid. That quiet trust, earned slowly, wasn't just healing him, it was beginning to heal her too. Not from loss, but from a life where she had rarely been looked at and seen for who she was. Here, in the unlikeliest place, with the unlikeliest child, she was becoming whole. When she passed Robert in the hallway later, neither of them spoke, but he paused as she passed, just enough for her to notice. His hands weren't clenched this time. His eyes weren't guarded. She stopped too. "He named the duck," she said. Robert blinked, confused. "He called it Mama." For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a voice rougher than usual, he asked, "Do you think that's good or bad?" Clarara considered it. "I think it means he remembers something, or someone, and that's more than most children his age can say." Robert nodded once and kept walking. It wasn't approval, it wasn't closure, but it was a step. One small, uneven, necessary step. By the time Clarara returned to her room, the house felt different, not warmer, not more alive, but less frozen. She lay on her bed, arms crossed over her chest, staring at the ceiling. She had entered this house thinking Theo was the one who needed saving, but now she saw that the child had learned to survive in a world of silence. It was the man, the billionaire with all the means and none of the courage, who hadn't yet begun to live again. She didn't know how to fix him. Maybe she wasn't meant to, but she had entered a space where the real vacancy wasn't in the rooms. It was in the hearts refusing to grieve. And maybe, just maybe, her presence here was the first breath of something that dared to feel again. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Theo Hensley, our new youth ambassador. The host's voice echoed through the hall as polite applause began, scattered and uncertain. Theo was wheeled to the center of the stage by a discreet aide, dressed in a navy blue blazer, a soft white shirt beneath it, and shoes that still had tiny stickers on their soles. His hair was carefully combed, and his hands trembled slightly in his lap. Behind the podium, Robert stood tall, microphone in hand, a rare expression of vulnerability barely concealed beneath his well-practiced composure. This was the Foundation's first public gala since his wife's death, and introducing Theo was meant to mark a turning point, not only for the Hensley brand, but for his own ability to be seen not just as a CEO, but as a father. As Theo's chair came to a stop at the center of the spotlight, he froze. His fingers curled tightly around the armrests, and his breath came in short bursts. Robert glanced down, his voice faltering mid-sentence. Theo's mouth opened slightly, but no sound followed. The room shifted from warmth to tension in an instant. The applause died. Guests exchanged glances. Cameras hovered in place. Theo was stuck. Clarara had been watching from the wings, hidden behind a velvet curtain, prepared only to assist if asked, not to interrupt. But the second she saw his shoulders tighten, his lips press into a flat line of fear, she knew. She didn't ask permission. She walked. Calmly, but with purpose, she crossed the floor behind the stage staff, stepped into the blinding light, and moved to Theo's side without looking at Robert or the audience. No one stopped her. No one dared. She knelt beside Theo, her knees hitting the wood softly. She leaned in and whispered, something no one could hear. Then, slowly and deliberately, she slipped, stumbled sideways, and fell, hard. Her arms flailed with enough theater to make it look real, but her landing was harmless. For a second, the entire room was stunned. Then a single laugh broke the silence. Theo's, sharp, joyful, unfiltered. He laughed with his whole chest, pointing at her with a crooked finger, and then he reached toward her, leaned forward as far as his body allowed, and whispered into the microphone in a voice steadier than anyone had ever heard. "My friend." The room erupted. Laughter, applause, and tears. The cameras clicked rapidly, flashes capturing the raw, unscripted moment. Clara Ara lifted herself slowly, grinning up at Theo like he'd just won the Nobel Prize. He looked down at her, triumphant, proud, transformed. She dusted herself off and gave him a thumbs up before backing off the stage, letting the light return to him. Robert stood frozen, his face unreadable, but as the applause continued, something cracked. His shoulders shook once, then again. His hand moved to his face, fingers brushing beneath his eyes. He didn't move to speak. He didn't finish the speech. He simply stepped back, one hand on Theo's shoulder, the other clenched by his side. For the first time, the billionaire who had built empires with stoic silence stood in public, crying not from grief, but from something closer to release. And no one judged him for it. Later, after the stage had been cleared, and guests had filtered into the lounge areas with their champagne and quiet conversations, Clara Ara walked alone through the garden behind the event hall. The string lights glowed above the hedges, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and trampled grass. She was tired, but not in the way that called for rest, tired in the way that follows truth. She didn't hear Robert's steps behind her, but she sensed him before he spoke. "That wasn't in the program," he said. She turned, arms crossed. "Neither was his silence," she replied. He walked beside her now, slow, uncertain, as if unsure if this was his moment or hers. "I've spent millions on campaigns," he said quietly. "Dozens of experts, endless strategies, and none of them got him to say more than one-word answers in public." He paused. "And you made him laugh, then speak, in front of 500 people." Clara Ara didn't answer. She let him say what he needed. "You made him look at the world without fear," he continued. "Not because you fixed him, because you let him see that falling wasn't failure." She finally turned to face him fully. "Kids don't need perfection. They need safety," she said. "And laughter." Robert nodded. Once slowly, then he held something out. Her name badge from the event, now creased, the lanyard tangled. "He kept asking for it," he said. "Said it was proof you were important." She took it from him, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. "He's the one who's important," she said. "You know that now, right?" Robert didn't look away. "I do, but so are the people who see him before they see his chair." He took a breath, then, without ceremony or hesitation, reached for her hand. Not a gesture of power, not dominance. It was quiet, intentional. His fingers curled around hers like someone holding onto the edge of something they weren't ready to let go of. Clara didn't pull away. For the first time, Robert didn't see her as staff or an exception to protocol. He saw her as someone essential, someone who had shifted the course of his son's life and maybe his own. They stood, in silence, not the heavy kind that haunted the halls of his house, but the peaceful kind that follows something real. Clara Ara watched the reflection of the lights in the garden's shallow fountain, still holding Robert's hand. "He called me his friend," she said softly. Robert smiled, just slightly. "I know. I've never seen him call anyone that." She glanced at him. "Not even you?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "Especially not me." The words hung there, honest and unguarded. Clara Ara squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement. This wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning. One, built not on duty or title, but on what could grow between people when fear wasn't leading. When she returned to the mansion that night, Theo was already asleep. The duck plush he still called Mama nestled under his arm. Clara Ara paused in his doorway, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. She knew there would be challenges ahead, therapy sessions, decisions about education, the slow work of helping Robert learn how to truly father. But for the first time, the weight of it didn't scare her, because the boy who once couldn't speak had found a voice, because the man who couldn't grieve had finally let something go, because a single fall, intentional, ridiculous, human, had made hundreds of strangers see a little boy not as a symbol, but as a person. And somewhere between that fall and that laugh, Clara Ara had stepped into a place she never imagined, not as a guest in someone else's, but as someone who belonged. We put a lot of heart and care into creating each story, always thinking of you on the other side of the screen. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts with us in the comments. We truly love hearing what you feel and think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you more meaningful content like this. Each video takes days of research, writing and production, all done with a lot of love. If you're up for more heartfelt moments, take a look at our other videos too. Thank you for being here with us. See you next time.